I want to tell you something I have never said out loud to anyone, not in exactly this way. I want to tell you about the morning I stood in front of my wardrobe for 11 minutes and did nothing. Just stood there. My coffee was going cold on the counter. I could hear the radiator ticking. The bus I'd take to work was probably already pulling away from the stop at the end of the road, and I was just standing there, staring at a row of clothes that felt like they belonged to someone I used to be, or maybe someone I had simply agreed to pretend to be for a very long time. That was 8 months ago. A Tuesday. I remember it because Tuesdays have always felt like the longest day of the week to me. Not Monday, which carries at least the drama of beginning, but Tuesday, which is just the interior of a long stretch with no particular promise on either end. I had been under considerable pressure at work. Not the kind of pressure that makes the news, nothing dramatic. Just the slow grind of expectation, the constant low hum of having to be useful and capable and available. I managed a small team. I was good at it, or at least I performed being good at it well enough that no one questioned it. I answered emails at 10 in the evening. I prepared for meetings I would not lead. I made other people feel confident in rooms where I felt like a stranger to myself. Outside of work, my life was quiet in the way that can be mistaken for peace. I cooked dinner. I watched things on my laptop. I spoke to my sister on the phone every Sunday. I had friends, the kind you text occasionally and meet for coffee twice a year, and genuinely like, without really letting in. Nothing was wrong exactly. And yet everything felt slightly off, the way a picture hangs crooked on a wall. You can live with it for months without fixing it, but you always know. What I had not admitted to myself, not properly, was that I had been cross-dressing in small, private ways for years. Not regularly. Not with any ritual or intention. More like the way you might press your thumb against a bruise, just to feel something locate itself precisely, just to know the exact outline of a thing. I owned 2 items I had bought online and had delivered to a post office box. A camisole in a soft gray, thin-strapped and simple, and a pair of high-waisted briefs in blush cotton with a little scalloped edge along the waistband. I had bought them separately months apart, from different shops. I had worn them a handful of times, usually late at night when I could not sleep, and then folded them away under a stack of winter jumpers I never touched. I did not have a name for what this was. I was not sure I needed one. What I knew was that wearing them felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a long time. Not excitement, not exactly. More like relief. Like remembering that my body existed for me, and not only for the world's expectations of it. On that Tuesday morning, standing at the wardrobe, I finally asked myself a question I had been avoiding. Not a dramatic question. Not one of the big ones about identity or label, or what it all means. Just this. What would make me feel like myself today? And the answer came quietly, before I could override it. I want to wear the camisole under my shirt. I want to feel it against my skin while I walk to the bus stop and sit in that meeting and eat my lunch alone in the small room with the broken blinds. I want something, just one small thing, that is entirely mine. So I did. I wore a plain white Oxford shirt over it, tucked into dark trousers. Nobody saw. Nobody knew. I caught the next bus, 12 minutes late. I sat in the meeting. I answered questions calmly. But underneath everything, against my skin, there was that thin gray fabric, that quiet softness, and it felt like a small act of sovereignty. That was the beginning. Not the beginning of anything I would have predicted. Just the beginning of paying attention to myself again. In the weeks that followed, I noticed things I had stopped noticing. The way my shoulders tensed when I answered certain emails. The way I held my jaw tight through long afternoons. The way my breathing was shallow in the mornings, as if I was rationing air. I had spent so long performing competence and stability that I had stopped checking in with what was actually happening underneath. I started to be more deliberate about the mornings. I would get up 20 minutes earlier, not to do more, but to do the same things more slowly. I made the coffee properly with the small pot instead of the instant granules I had been using for months. I ate breakfast at the table instead of over the sink. Small things. Embarrassingly small, but they made a difference I could not quite explain. I also bought a full-length mirror. I had not owned one in years. I put it on the back of the bedroom door and started, very gradually, to look at myself. Not critically. Not with the punishing eye. I usually turned on my own reflection. Just looking. Just acknowledging that I was there. I had begun doing some research, carefully and privately, into breast forms. I had been aware of them for a long time in the abstract way you are aware of things you are not ready to think about. But something had shifted. I was not frightened by the curiosity anymore. I was curious about the curiosity itself. What was I drawn to? What did I imagine? What did the idea of having a soft, gentle shape at my chest make me feel? What it made me feel was calm. That surprised me. I had expected excitement or embarrassment. Instead it was calm, the same calm as the camisole, the same sense of something aligning. I did not rush. I spent several evenings reading, looking at options, understanding sizing and materials, thinking about what I actually wanted and why. I treated it the way I might treat any considered purchase, with patience and attention. And that patience itself was new. I was learning to take my own desires seriously enough to be thoughtful about them. There is a particular kind of self-consciousness that comes with shopping for things that were not designed with you in mind. I had felt it before, buying the camisole, buying the briefs, but this was different in scale. I was looking at breast forms now, at soft silicone shapes in varying cup sizes, and the websites I found were mostly aimed at people after mastectomies or transgender women, and I read every description carefully, not to appropriate someone else's experience but to understand the practical information I needed. What I needed, I decided, was something subtle, not dramatic. Something that would fit under a soft bra and create a gentle, natural shape, the kind of curve that reads as simply present rather than announced. I did not want to be performing anything. I wanted, as much as I had wanted anything in a long time, to feel like myself. I ordered a pair of size B silicone forms and a soft wireless bra in a neutral tone. I chose a brand that was clear about their sizing and had detailed guidance. I paid with my card and had it delivered to the post office box, same as before. While I waited for the delivery, which took about 10 days, I continued my mornings. The early rises, the real coffee, the table instead of the sink. I started doing some gentle stretching before getting dressed, just a few minutes, but it changed how I moved through the early part of the day. I stood up straighter. My neck released some of its permanent tension. I noticed that when I felt physically present and deliberate, I made better decisions at work. Not dramatically better. No one noticed or praised anything, but I noticed. I was less reactive. I took slightly longer to respond to things that would have previously made me tense. I also started to think about clothing in a different way. Not in the sense of shopping extravagantly or changing my entire wardrobe, but in the sense of paying attention to texture and fit. I had been wearing clothes that were functional rather than felt. I bought 2 soft knit jumpers in neutral colors, the kind of fabric that is gentle against skin. I bought a pair of wide-leg trousers that moved differently from the stiff chinos I had been wearing. These were not coded as feminine items, they were simply things that felt good to wear, that allowed me to be comfortable in my own skin. The package arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I collected it on my lunch break, carried it home in my bag, and left it on the kitchen table until the evening. I wanted to open it when I had time and quiet, not in a rush, not with one eye on the clock. When I did open it after dinner, after washing up, after making tea, I was struck by how ordinary the moment was. I had imagined it would feel significant in some large way. Instead, it just felt careful. I took the forms out of their packaging. They were heavier than I had expected, pleasantly so. They were body temperature, within a minute of being held. I read the care instructions. I tried the bra on first, fitted it properly, adjusted the band, and then placed the forms into the cups. I stood at the mirror. My full-length mirror, which I had only owned for a few weeks, but which I was slowly making peace with. The shape was subtle, exactly as I had intended. Under a loose shirt or a soft jumper, it would be invisible to anyone not looking for it. But I could see it. I could feel the gentle weight. I stood with my shoulders back, not performing confidence, just experiencing it. Something settled. I stood there for a while, not crying, not laughing, not feeling anything as legible as an emotion. Just present. Just there. Just myself, a little more precisely than I had been before. Over the following weeks, I began to develop what I can only call a private ritual of mornings. It sounds more elaborate than it was. It was simply this. I would get up early, make coffee, and spend the first part of the morning dressed in ways that felt genuinely comfortable to me. Sometimes that meant the bra and forms under a soft top. Sometimes the camisole. Sometimes just my own regular clothes, but chosen with more attention. The point was not the specific items. The point was the attention. The point was asking myself every morning what I needed and taking the answer seriously. I am aware this might sound like a small thing. I am aware that to someone reading this, it might seem like I am describing very little. But I think that is part of what I want to say. Transformation, at least the kind that lasts, rarely announces itself. It tends to arrive in the form of slightly different mornings, of slightly more deliberate choices, of noticing one day that you are standing differently, breathing differently, eating breakfast at the table instead of over the sink. At work, the change was internal and therefore largely invisible. But I began to advocate for myself more. Small instances. I spoke up in a meeting about a deadline I thought was unrealistic. I sent an email that took me 15 drafts over 3 days, setting a boundary with a colleague who had been consistently undermining my input. I declined one obligation I had been dreading for weeks and felt, for the first time in a long time, like I had the right to do so. My sister noticed something on the phone one Sunday. She said, "You sound different." I asked her how. She thought about it and said, "More like yourself." I did not explain. I just said, "I've been sleeping better." That was not entirely untrue. There is something I want to be careful about here because I am aware that when people tell stories of personal change, they sometimes flatten the difficulty, skip the uncertain middle, move too quickly toward the version that sounds resolved. I do not want to do that. The honest truth is that there were mornings, even after I had begun my routines, even after the forms arrived and I stood at the mirror and felt something settle, where everything felt fragile again. There was a week in late autumn where work became suddenly, acutely difficult. A project I had been leading quietly for months was reassigned in a meeting I was not invited to. My input, the hours of preparation, simply vanished into someone else's responsibilities. I sat at my desk afterward and felt the old familiar sensation of being both present and erased. That week, I skipped the early mornings. I went back to instant coffee over the sink. I wore whatever was on the top of the pile. I stopped stretching. I stopped looking in the mirror. By the end of the week, I noticed what I had done. Not with judgment. I am learning not to be punishing with myself, but with interest. I noticed that when I stopped the small rituals, something in me also went quieter, the part that had been slowly finding its voice. The connection was not mystical. It was simply the connection between attention and presence. When I stopped attending to myself, I also stopped being present to myself. On the Saturday of that week, I made a deliberate effort to start again. Not from a place of self-improvement, not with the energy of someone making resolutions. Just quietly. I made the real coffee. I ate at the table. I put on the bra and the forms and a long, loose cardigan I had recently bought and genuinely loved, and I sat by the window with my coffee and looked at the street. I thought about posture. Posture is one of those things that sounds like it belongs in a lifestyle article, the kind of advice that comes between tips about hydration and gratitude journals. But I have come to think about it differently. I think about posture as the physical expression of how much space I am willing to take up. For a long time I had been making myself smaller. Not dramatically, not visibly, just a slight forward curve, a slight drop of the shoulders, the body arranging itself around the assumption that it was taking up too much room. Wearing the bra and forms changed how I held my chest. It sounds obvious written down, but the physical reality of it was that I began to stand differently. Not puffed up or performed, just upright. The slight weight, the soft shape, encouraged a kind of openness in how I held my upper body. I stood with my shoulders back not because I was telling myself to, but because it felt right, because the shape of me in that moment asked for it. I began to pay attention to posture throughout the day. Not rigidly, not as another thing to perform correctly. Just noticing. Noticing when I was hunching over my keyboard. Noticing when I was holding my jaw tight. Noticing when I had been still for too long and my body was asking to move. Around this time, I also began to think more carefully about the idea of self-care, a phrase I had always found faintly irritating because it had become so detached from anything real, so associated with expensive candles and bubble baths and purchasing things as a form of feeling better. What I mean by self-care is something more unglamorous than that. What I mean is attending to one's own maintenance the way you would attend to the maintenance of anything you wanted to keep functioning well. I started sleeping regular hours. Not perfectly. I am not describing a flawless life here, but with more consistency. I went to bed at roughly the same time and got up at roughly the same time, and within a few weeks my mornings felt less like emerging from sediment and more like arriving somewhere. I drank water, which sounds absurd to mention, but which I had been neglecting to the point where I routinely had dull headaches by 3 in the afternoon that I had simply been accepting as part of the day. I cooked dinner most evenings, not elaborate meals, just food that I had chosen with some thought for what my body actually wanted. I found this more satisfying than I expected. There is something in the act of cooking for yourself that is not nothing. It is a small act of saying, my appetite matters. My appetite is worth attending to. I also bought 2 more bras. I want to mention this because it felt significant in a quiet way. Buying the first had been careful and slightly anxious. Buying the second and third felt matter-of-fact. I ordered them with attention to fit and fabric. I noted what worked and what didn't. I treated it as any ordinary practical matter deserving of ordinary practical attention. That normalization felt like progress. The lingerie I needed, as the title of the story suggests, was for a chest that had begun to develop in a way that was new to me. Not physically, my body has not changed, but in the sense of how I understood and inhabited it. My chest had become a part of me I was beginning to acknowledge and attend to, where before it had simply been there unremarked, another feature of a body I mostly related to as transport for my head. I needed lingerie for my new budding chest in the sense of needing to take seriously for the first time that this part of my body was something I could have a relationship with, something I could dress with care and intention, something I could feel present in rather than absent from. The word budding is right in a metaphorical sense. Something was growing. Something that had been dormant was slowly arriving. By winter I had developed what I would describe not as a regimen, but as a rhythm. There is a difference, I think. A regimen is something you impose on yourself from the outside, a series of obligations you hold yourself to account for. A rhythm is something you find within yourself, a pattern of moving through time that feels natural enough that you return to it because it genuinely serves you. My mornings looked, by this point, something like this. I would wake without the alarm most days, which I attributed to the more consistent sleep. I would make coffee with a small pot and bring it to the table. I would spend a few minutes at the window simply noticing the day, the light, the weather, the sound. Not meditating exactly, not doing anything prescribed, just pausing before the day began to demand things of me. Then I would dress. And this, the dressing, had become something I took time over. Not in an anxious or performative way. In a caring way. I would choose what I was wearing with attention to how I wanted to feel, not only how I needed to present. When I was wearing the bra and forms, I would put them on carefully, adjust everything properly, take a moment at the mirror. When I was not, and there were many days when I dressed in entirely conventional ways, I still chose with attention. I had begun to think of the daily choice as a form of checking in. What do I need today? What does my body feel like? What kind of support, physical, emotional, aesthetic, am I asking for right now? Answering these questions, even loosely, even approximately, changed how I moved through the day. At work, things had not transformed dramatically. The colleague who had been undermining me continued occasionally doing so, though less successfully, once I had begun to respond differently. The project that had been taken from me was not returned. None of the external facts of my professional life had rearranged themselves because I had started caring for my mornings. But my relationship to those facts had shifted. I was less ground down by the friction. I recovered faster from the small defeats. I had more resource. I think this is because self-care, genuine self-care, is not about creating conditions in which nothing is hard. It is about maintaining enough of yourself that when things are hard, you're still there to face them. I want to tell you about a specific evening because it captures something I am trying to describe. It was a Wednesday in December. I had had a genuinely difficult day. Not catastrophically so, Just the accumulation of small things. A missed deadline that was not my fault but had been handled as though it were. A conversation with my manager that left me feeling unseen. The particular exhaustion of performing calm for 8 hours. I came home, and instead of doing what I might have done before, eating something quick and distracted, scrolling until I felt slightly worse, going to bed too late, I made a deliberate choice. I ran a bath. I put on music, something gentle and instrumental. I took my time. After the bath, I moisturized properly, which is not something I had previously done with any consistency. I put on the soft camisole and a pair of pajama trousers I had recently bought in a deep burgundy, a color I had somehow always known I liked but never allowed myself to wear. I made chamomile tea. I sat on the sofa and read an actual book. None of this is remarkable. I am aware of that. But it was completely unlike the version of myself from 8 months earlier. The one standing at the wardrobe for 11 minutes, the one making himself smaller in meetings, the one with the constant low-level headache from not drinking enough water. The difference was not the bath, not the camisole, not the burgundy trousers. The difference was that I had decided somewhere along the way that I was worth taking care of. That seems like a small decision. It was not. It took the better part of a year to arrive at. I had by this point begun to think more clearly about what crossdressing meant to me, not as an identity claim, but as a practice. I have read enough to know that the territory is vast and varied, that people who crossdress do so for an enormous range of reasons and in an enormous range of ways, and that none of those reasons require the same language or the same conclusions. For me, it was about reclaiming a kind of tenderness toward my own body that I had somewhere along the way abandoned. The softness of the fabrics, the care of the fit, the attention to how something felt against skin. These were not about performing femininity. They were about taking seriously that I had a body and that my body deserved to be dressed with kindness. That might sound like a small thing. I keep saying that it might sound like a small thing. I suppose I keep saying it because I want you to understand that the smallness is the point. This is not a story about revelation or transformation in the cinematic sense. It is a story about the slow, unglamorous work of deciding you matter enough to attend to. I want to be precise about where I am now because I think precision is important and I have become suspicious of stories that resolve too cleanly. I am not happy in the way that word implies consistent sunlit ease. I still have difficult days. I still have weeks where the routine slips and I feel the old fog settling. My professional situation has improved somewhat. I have had some recognition, some better conversations with management, but the structural frustrations have not disappeared. I still hold my jaw tight sometimes. I still miss the bus occasionally because I stood too long at the wardrobe. But I am stable in a way I was not before. And stability, I have come to understand, is something genuinely worth having, something that should not be dismissed because it is less photogenic than triumph. Emotional stability means that when something hard happens, I do not disappear into it the way I used to. I do not spend days in the same gray interior, unable to locate myself. I have enough of a foundation, the routines, the small rituals, the basic maintenance of my own existence, that difficult things remain difficult without becoming total. I think this is what the crossdressing gave me, or helped me discover. Not the items themselves, not the camisole or the forms or the bras, but the practice of attending to myself with care. The practice of choosing, each morning, to take my own experience seriously. The practice of asking what I needed and treating the answer as a valid thing. My wardrobe looks different now than it did 8 months ago. Not dramatically, I have not overhauled everything. But there are items in it that are genuinely mine, chosen for how they feel and what they mean to me. The gray camisole, still folded carefully, but now alongside a second one in white. The blush briefs and 3 more pairs in similar styles. 2 bras, wireless and soft. The burgundy pajama trousers. The wide-leg trousers that move differently. The knit jumpers. The long cardigan. When I stand at the wardrobe now, I am not frozen. I am choosing. That seems worth saying. That the simple fact of choosing, of having a self to choose from and for, is something that required work to recover. Not crisis work, not dramatic intervention. Just the quiet, consistent work of paying attention. I have not told anyone the details of this story. I am telling it now, here, because I think there may be others who are in the earlier parts of it who are standing at their wardrobes for 11 minutes, who are holding their breath without realizing it, who have tucked something that genuinely comforts them under a pile of jumpers they never touch. I want to say to those people, the tenderness you feel toward yourself in those private moments is not weakness. The softness you reach for is not a problem to be solved. The desire to feel comfortable in your own skin, to dress for how you feel rather than only for how you are expected to appear, is a completely ordinary and human thing. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to stand at the mirror and see yourself. You are allowed to choose the fabric that feels kind. You are allowed to rebuild, slowly and without fanfare, a relationship with your own body that is based on care rather than performance. It does not require a dramatic moment of arrival. It does not require a label or a declaration or a complete rethinking of your life. It might just require an 11-minute morning at the wardrobe, a question quietly asked, and the willingness to hear the answer. I needed lingerie for my new budding chest. I needed to take seriously that I had a chest and a body and a self that deserved to be dressed with attention. That is where I am. Not at the end of anything. Not at the top of a hill, looking out at something resolved. Just here, in the ordinary middle of a life, making real coffee in the morning, eating at the table, standing a little straighter, choosing carefully and deciding each day that this is worth doing. That is enough. For now and for a long time to come, that is more than enough.